Exciting update.
And we're live.
House Education is back. It's Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025. We are now going to get an update as to sort of the perspective from Washington, from the Agency of Education. I have nothing more to say. Welcome. Thank you for your time in Washington last week. Floor is yours.
Good morning, folks. Jill Briggs Campbell, Deputy Secretary of Education. And Board Narrow Director of Federal and Education Support Programs, and it's great to be back with you all. All right, so.
Is it really though?
I mean, no, it is. Yeah, Peter, you had texted me midweek last week and sort of said like, how bad is it? And at the time, I was like, it's not as bad as we think. And then if you'd asked me that question Friday evening, I would have had a different answer. Yeah. So, and I think that that's really indicative of, what we are observing. So last week, Ann and I were in Washington, D.C. for the CCSSO, which is the Council of Chief State School Officers. Thank you.
Yes.
It's so with state education leaders from across the country had an opportunity to meet with leaders from the Department of Education, also, some political folks as well, to really try to get a sense of the landscape. And I would say that the landscape is dynamic and uncertain. And what we're observing is really that we're observing an administration that doesn't seem to be coordinating with itself. We provided some written testimony. I've kind of laid the groundwork for that. We did have the opportunity to meet with Secretary McMahon, also Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, Haley Sannon, and the nominated Deputy Secretary of Education, Penny Schwinn. So those were all sort of closed door conversations that, our education leaders had an opportunity to ask questions. In those meetings, they verbally assured us multiple times that they are prioritizing the continued funding and staffing within the Department of Education to support what they're calling core education programs. Specifically, they referenced Title I and IDEA multiple times. I would not say they referenced other programs with the same consistency. They also have committed to getting allocations for school year 2025-26 for these programs out within roughly normal timeframes. As of last week, they had said 2 weeks. So we will see if that's what we can expect. And as we have continually done throughout the last couple of months, we are continuing to rely on what is put in writing. Both from the Department of Education, from trusted sources like CCSSO, and from our partners at the federal delegation, who we also had an opportunity to meet with all three teams. And we're in, I would say, very, very close daily contact with them right now. As a state, however, we are preparing for potential fiscal and programmatic impacts. We are carefully taking a look at all of the sort of state level priorities and also LEA needs. And I think that this last week, as previous weeks, but this one really highlighted, this is the first time we felt a direct financial impact. And so I think for us, this highlights the urgency of the work that you are all doing and we're doing collaboratively. We're vulnerable as a state to these kinds of external changes. And so as we look forward into the future, how do we've talked about future proofing, right? And not just for changes in federal administration, but global pandemics, right? How do we actually create an education system that is resilient to these kinds of impacts? And right now we are signaling that we are not. We have some real vulnerabilities here. Kind of just run a show here. I'll briefly talk about the change to liquidation extension and COVID era funds, which was sort of the big whammy that hit us Friday evening. And then Ann can provide some detailed updates about what we understand about kind of the budgeting process and some of the complexities and some other trends that we're seeing. So on March 26th, in a meeting with Haley Sannon, I directly asked the question, I stood up and asked the question, can you please confirm for us that the COVID era funds, so we're talking about, at this point, ARP, ESSER, no longer Carissa for us. We're actually clear of that, I've confirmed, but it's called the Carissa or the ARP EAMS program, and then the ARP Homeless Children and Youth. It's kind of our three COVID era funds that are still live. Can you please confirm for us that we will continue to have access for these funds for approved liquidation extension and we will be reimbursed? And she said unequivocally, yes, I can confirm that. By the time my plane landed on Friday afternoon, I took it off of airplane mode and it was ding, 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 ding. And we were hearing rumors that the Department of Ed was going to release a directive that basically froze access to those funds by 5 p.m. In response, immediately was talking to members of AOE staff, what can we submit by 5 p.m.? We were able to submit $1.3 million for reimbursement at that time that was ready to go. We don't yet have approval, but we were at least able to meet that deadline. The actual letter from the Department of Education from Secretary McMahon was released at 5:03. So the cutoff was 5 p.m. and the letter was released at 5:03. So that gives you a sense of where we're at.
Dirty trick.
Yeah. So we immediately communicated this information to the field with a recommendation that they reach out to any, at this point, just sort of lay of the land where we're at is the liquidation extension has allowed for the extension of services beyond the normal period of performance and liquidation period, which is 120 days after that September 30th, 2024 deadline we talked about so much. Our district and the agency have used that flexibility to maximize federal dollars. And it has to be done through contracted services. That's a requirement. A lot of which is, professional development, direct supports for student mental health, the completion of construction projects that because of workforce and supply chain constraints, we're not able to finish. So these are, direct ongoing supports that are being provided. So our recommendation at that time, Friday at 6 p.m. was to reach out to your vendors and pause grant funded activities. We took steps to do that on Monday. We've been in touch with all of our state level vendors. And I'll talk about some of the implications of that for work that is ongoing.
Can I just stop, just
please.
get a little bit of a baseline understanding?
Sure.
So this is COVID era dollars,
Yeah.
ARP, ESSER, all of that.
Mhm.
And there was always sort of like whether you spended it or obligated it, there was always a difference.
Yeah.
My recollection in talking about this last year was that in fact, sort of school districts and the AOE had really done a very good job of obligating those
Yes.
dollars.
That's right.
There really wasn't a whole lot kicking around that was going to save the world.
Yes.
But is the difference here that many of those obligated dollars have not been expended and that's what they're trying to claw back?
I would say we can take a step. We'll get a little bit weedy here.
Okay.
So in any normal federal grant, there's a period of performance when you must obligate and perform the activities. And that period of performance for ESSER dollars, because that's really what we're talking about here. For the most part, there's a couple others, but that period of performance ended on September 30th of 2024. Under the Biden administration, and then after that, everyone has what's called a liquidation period. It's where you pay your invoices and close out your grants. And we do that. First, the LEAs do it, the districts, and then we do it at the state level. And we do a final submission for reimbursement. Your cost, right? Under the Biden administration, the Department of Education offered what was called a liquidation extension. It's a discretion that they always have. Normally, it's only used not to perform activities, but for additional time if you need additional closeout time, basically. So it's a discretion they've always had for any federal program. And they determined that they were able to offer states and districts the ability to perform activities through an extended liquidation period. At the time, the states said, can you please help us understand where that authority comes from? We had a real back and forth. They sort of released a lot of written documentation that said you can do this. The districts had to show that they had in fact obligated through contracts by September 30th, that it was an allowable cost, that it was in their ESSER application, all of those things. The Agency of Education developed a very robust review process. It was actually more robust than other states did, and so that was a good thing for us. We would then review and give that preliminary approval, and the Department of Ed said if the state has given preliminary approval, districts should go ahead and perform those activities. We then submit to the Department of Education in a big ugly spreadsheet, and they would provide approval when they got around to it. So that everyone was following process, and I think that's really important to know. Everyone was following the process. In January, they changed the reimbursement request process. Instead of just being able to submit to G5, which is where we submit for reimbursement, they added an additional step. We followed that step. Then a few weeks later, they said, oh, we're going to change it again. We don't know what it looks like yet. Hold. And so we all held, right? Hold your reimbursement request. We don't know what it looks like yet. That meant that our districts also couldn't submit for reimbursement. And so everyone's been kind of holding. And then this came through, and we've linked the letter. I would say it's remarkable in its tone. Its message is essentially anything that the Department of Ed committed to under the previous administration, you should not count on that. Basically, we have no obligation to follow any previous decisions. We don't think that it was a good idea. And so therefore, we will review on a project by project basis, and they're not clear on what a project means. That's not a term that means anything in federal uniform guidance. We'll review waivers on a project by project basis, and they've also changed the sort of rules or terms by which they will review those projects. It's no longer aligned to the original sort of language of ESSER. So ESSER was prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID, and there was like 15 allowable uses. The new terms under which they have said they will review is how does this activity basically address the needs of American students, is sort of the language that they've used, and why should the department give you this extended waiver? So, and that is all. That's the only communication that we have at this point. We don't know what the process is. We don't know if districts are supposed to send emails. We don't know if the state is supposed to send emails on behalf. We don't know if there's additional documentation required, what the format should be. So clearly everyone's following up with the Department of Education. I have an email out to them right now and have not received a response.
I just want to be clear on a couple of things. This is, so they said everything on a project by project basis. I would imagine that must be tens of thousands of projects across the country.
Yes.
And this is the newly slimmed down Department of Education that is going to be going through this project by project.
And I don't think necessarily that we should assume that it's Department of Education folks doing the reviewing.
Who do you think is, sorry,
Yeah.
who do you think is doing the
It's
reviewing?
not clear, but reading between the lines of some of the statements that were made, I suspect it might be Dick.
And
So
do you have
these
a
are
sense
not
of-
folks who have any experience with the grant.
The fact that the ed folks were taken so aback by this, the ones we talked to, you know, it sounded like they learned about it at the same time we did.
how much money are we talking?
Yeah,
about?
so this is, this is where we're at. So to your point, there's been a tremendous amount of federal dollars through COVID funds, 500 million upwards. And just the ARP ESSER alone was 256 million. We are not in that ballpark. So I just want to sort of assure folks. We have, we're going through a detailed review right now of all of the LEAs, the districts. We're estimating right now that they have about $16.7 million of sort of what I would call exposure here, but they're all in different categories, so that's not a blanket statement. Some of them have literally been sitting on their reimbursements while we were all told to wait. So they have paid their vendors already, and they now are not able to, or we don't know what the process is for them to be reimbursed. Some of them, and of those, some of them were doing approved liquidation extension activities, and some of them sort of fit with what I would call the classic. They just needed more time to close out. They didn't close out by the deadline. And so normally that's kind of a no-brainer. You would ask the Department of Education, hey, we've got some districts that need additional closeout time, and they would say, sure, and they would reopen the grant. So we have some in that category, some that actually did extended activities and have paid their vendors. And then we have some that may have either activities live right now, or maybe we're even doing something like planning for a summer program. So they might be, partially spent the funds and paid vendors. So we've got a whole variety. We're in direct contact with districts right now. We're doing one-on-one meetings. We're doing office hours. We're sharing everything that we know.
Could I ask, like, what's the highest exposure a district has on an individual basis?
I think off the top of my head, it's $5 million, but I don't know to what extent. Some portion of that may have already been reimbursed and some might be ongoing. The places where we have the higher numbers are the folks that were closing out construction projects. Obviously, because that's where the big dollars would be. And so we also are, this is live work right now. We're working to understand, do they have ceilings ripped out and HVAC going in, right? Or are they putting up the paint, and actually the project is done and closed.
Representative Taylor?
Could we just back up for a second? When was the hold applied? You said that there was
The reimbursement hold?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I can go back and look, but it was early February. So they had instituted a new process. We were following that new process. We were still getting reimbursements. Then there was we're going to do a new process, but we don't know what it is. And at that point, we had to tell everybody, hold. And then we also, right in March 14th, before the OESC, our state partners were ripped and laid off, they said submit because there was never a deadline, right, for these liquidation extensions. They said submit anything that you have left. And that was a chunk of districts that needed that extended closeout time. So we submitted that March 14th. We submitted that request, and then I received an email on Friday morning or Thursday morning that said, we're not reviewing this. So that was my first indication, and what I understood that to be, because I will tell you, I never anticipated this. This was pretty unprecedented, I would say. What I anticipated is that they were having a different team review, and that we might expect a higher degree of scrutiny. I did not anticipate that they would say it doesn't matter what we promised for people, you obligated funds and paid them. So that wasn't unanticipated. At the state level, we have, as I said, we've reached out to all of our vendors formally and paused all activities. There's a wide range of activities. Some of this is our Read Vermont initiative. So this is our embedded coaching. We had to reach out and cancel events. We're already hearing from districts about how they're really disappointed. This is going to impact the advancement of literacy work. So that's obviously a key priority for us, and we will be submitting for waivers for anything and everything. I just want to be very clear. We just don't know what that process is, and we want to position ourselves to have the highest chance of success that we can, right? Also, if anyone's ever heard me complain about ESSER annual performance reporting, it's the one requirement that has not gone away. And we had approval from the Department of Ed for liquidation extension for contract services. That data collection is live. Based on an email I got yesterday, that data collection is still due. There is still a deadline. That data sits on a platform that is run by our vendor. That is my very urgent email out right now is I have deadlines and our districts no longer have support or access to this platform. I will also say all of our vendors have been incredibly gracious. Not one of them is like, you can't call us anymore. So even that vendor has said, we will ensure that we will offload that data to you. But to be clear, this was a very labor intensive piece of work that like I managed for years and would require full stop of several people's jobs for weeks to get that done, including me.
Just the sort of offloading of the data from the vendor to the AOE.
To be able to complete the annual performance reporting is a huge undertaking. It was upwards of 8 to 10 weeks of my time, 60 hours a week for years, just for that initial submission. So that's critical. And we are not the only state in this position. There's at least one other state that is in this position. So that's very concerning. Our districts are, we have to continue to say as of this moment in time, you need to submit this data. But that's a big concern for me. We have a federally required report and yet the resources that we have available to submit it don't.
So can you bottom line, so we talked about, let's call it LEA exposure, you said about 60 million, what's the SEA exposure?
So we know right now we have about 360,000, but we've asked all of our vendors to submit any outstanding invoices, which they would not have submitted till depending on their contract for several more weeks. So they are all submitting by the end of the week and we'll have a better sense of what that is. So I don't even want to speculate at this point. I'm just not sure.
But the exposure of the agency is significantly less than the
Yeah.
exposure.
Yeah, we always had less money in this situation.
Josh.
In the last paragraph on the first page, it does talk about the ability to submit for and potentially obtain an extension on individual projects, it looks like. Are we working to start submitting those extensions?
Yes, so this is the work that's live right now. What we don't have is direction from the department. So what we have in that last paragraph is like submit by project. Project isn't a thing. That's not a term that has meaning. So we need to understand what a project is. So for example, we might have a district that has multiple projects, all of which might fit different categories, extended closeout or live, services they're providing or future services they were planning. Is that what they need? Do they want 10,000 emails, being submitted? So we are doing everything we can ahead of time, working with districts so that we are very well positioned when we get that direction. The concern is that Ed might say, you've got 3 days to submit everything. So we want to be ready and prepared. We do plan to submit waivers for everything at the SEA level. We're already talking to our LEAs. Do they have things that are closed out? Do they have things that they have a different funding source for? Or do they have things that they want to submit? We know that many of them do, and we'll be working with them. It's also a question of how do we position this for the highest rate of success? So we may do something like, pick a couple of projects that we think would have the highest rate of success and use them as test cases. We're just not sure yet. So that is the work of this week, occupying a lot of folks in the agency. So that is that. And now I can turn it over to Anne. And happy to take more questions on this really unfortunate circumstance that we all find ourselves in.
Any other questions?
I
Well,
will say
there probably
compared,
more.
yeah, I will also just say again, the districts did a really tremendous job in obligating and expending these funds. This could be a lot worse. We know that there are other states who have upwards of $100 million So
That they're not.
we are, it's not good, but we are, not as bad as we could be. And, all credit goes to the districts for their work to get these funds expended.
Yeah, the challenge is, of course, that a $16 million hit to the ed fund is like 16 million.
It is, yep, that is absolutely what we're doing.
Yeah. So speaking of funding, we got some more clarity.
Things with fun, right?
Fun, right?
Having fun.
Having fun here, yes. It's interesting because very little of what is going on fits into, I am just a bill on Capitol Hill, like. It doesn't matter that I majored in political science.
Thank you,
It doesn't-
Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah,
Shout out, all right.
it doesn't necessarily explain a lot of what's happening, including the funding stuff I'm gonna talk about in just a minute. So back to FY twenty-five, the fiscal year, federal FY twenty-five, which is the fiscal year that we are actually in. The Congress actually funds the federal government in two big budget categories, discretionary and mandatory. And there's actually a third, which is Social Security and Medicare, but that's got its own process. So education falls into the discretionary category, and that was what was covered by the continuing resolution a few weeks ago. There is still the lion's share of the federal budget for FY twenty-five, which falls into the mandatory category. So those are known as sort of entitlement programs. So Medicaid, nutrition programs like SNAP, child nutrition programs like school meals, things where they're means tested, and if you qualify, you get it. So there's no limit to how much could theoretically be spent. We still believe that the education programs, which were passed in the continuing resolution and are forward funded, are secure through 25-26. So nothing has changed there, nothing that we're aware of, nothing in writing. However, at this point, until we see the actual allocations, which Jill mentioned, we're hoping will come next week. We're going to be holding our breath. The other thing is that they did talk about IDEA and Title I. We have read that all of the programs were funded at FY 24 levels. That would mean Title II, Title III, Title IV, all of the others. But again, until we see the actual allocations, we're not going to feel entirely relaxed.
And those are the grants that we're holding that normally would be going,
Yes,
the applications would normally be going live.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So
So-
we're all holding.
We're all holding, and we have work to do once we do get those allocations. There's a lot of transformation of doing state set asides and hold harmless and different things before we can load them. So there's usually a 3 to 4 week at the fastest turnaround between what we get from the federal government and what we actually can load into the application, so that school districts can begin to apply for their consolidated program, title program funds for the new school year. One thing with the continuing resolution is it doesn't provide the line item kind of detail that a normal appropriation process does, which is why the Democrats in the House, unanimously opposed it. So we haven't seen line items, for example, for within IDEA, things like the Personnel Development Grant, or within ESEA, McKinney-Vento, the Homeless Grant Program. So again, we've been told, and sort of national information is that everybody got FY 24 funding, but as I said, until we actually see the numbers and the line items in the allocations that we get, we won't be entirely comfortable.
Is it a safe statement to say that FY 24 money is less than FY 25 money? Does FY 24 money mean a cut in what we generally receive in that combined title allocation?
No, yes and no. So anytime you have the same funding as you had the previous year, it's essentially a cut. Because unless you had negative growth, as long as you have inflation, it's essentially a cut. Last year, we had slightly higher amounts for certain programs than we did in FY 23. So FY 24 was slightly higher than FY 23 in certain grant programs. It was still probably a cut because inflation was running pretty high when they voted on that. So it was probably less of an increase than the actual rate of inflation. But we considered it a win, given what we were looking at last year in terms of substantial cuts being proposed by the House Republicans at that point in time. Zeroing out Title II, for example. We were happy to get FY 23 funding and FY 24 for Title II. So if we get FY '24 funds as we intend and we know what those are, and if we get the same amounts, which is what we're being told by different organizations, we will consider that a win, even though actually its actual spending power is slightly less again because of inflation. But within the major categories, there are all these smaller pieces, neglected and delinquent and migrant and homeless McKinney-Vento and, so it may be that the funding is there, but it's just not specified, which means states could, move it around, or it might be that it's actually specified, or it may not be there. We'll see. So Congress, however, still has to pass appropriations for the mandatory programs, which comprise, as I said, the lion's share of the budget. And this is where I mentioned last time I was here about needing to fund the 2017 tax cuts, which is a priority, renewal of those, which is a priority of the administration, along with increases in military and immigration enforcement spending for ICE. And they have to find substantial savings to do that. They also need to pass a debt ceiling because we're about to hit the debt ceiling, but that's separate potentially. So they've agreed on top line numbers for these sort of big categories. And that's where you may be familiar with the 880 billion in savings that have to be found. So increase military, increase in ICE enforcement, renew the tax cuts, something's got to give unless you're going to borrow even more money. And the give is the 880 billion. And so it has to come out of those mandatory programs. There aren't that many of them. The biggest one is Medicaid. I mean, we've been told, we all collectively, Americans have been told that child nutrition and Medicaid aren't going to be touched. No one believes it because it's impossible to come up with $880 billion unless you touch the major programs. However, there is a 10-year process for this. This is like a paper exercise, and it's such nonsense. It's a paper exercise. So it is possible that all the cuts could be in year 9 when all of us are long gone, but on paper, it looks like cuts happened, or it could be that the cuts happen in the fall or in the summer. We don't know. And our delegation told us that nothing is being shared with them. This is a reconciliation process. It does not depend on a single Democratic vote. It can go through with simple majorities in both houses, and they haven't seen anything yet. Nothing has been broken down that they've seen beyond the top line numbers. So when we talk to them about what our priorities would be, for example, in Medicaid, if you have to negotiate cuts, this is what we're hoping, you'll think about. They said, that's great to know, but it's way too early because we haven't seen anything. So come back to us when we see something.
Does that mean that but Congress people who are Republicans have seen it?
Not necessarily. I would say it probably depends. We don't know. It probably depends on which committees they're on.
Which Republicans?
Which Republicans, yes, exactly. Because of all of this, I can say that we have anxiety, and I know we're not the only state agency that does. I mentioned to you last time I was here about our concerns about Medicaid. Obviously, not just because we care about children's health, which we do, but also there's the school-based Medicaid program, which, funds kids on IEPs medical services, but we also get some of that back to use more broadly for things like mental health services and all.
And it goes into the ed fund as well.
Yes.
So I was going to ask, could you bottom line what we traditionally, or what we got in FY 24?
For the school-based Medicaid,
Just like how much Medicaid, the amount of Medicaid dollars that are in the ed.
I'm actually working on pulling those numbers with my finance team. I'll have them to you by end of day.
If you were to ballpark it right now, what would it be?
I would not be in the right ballpark.
Yeah. I don't.
It's
Um,
much larger stadium.
I think at the state level, oh man, okay, ballpark, I think it's 4 to 8 million. And then I am trying to remember what I've seen on the ed fund outlook, and I think it's about 14 million ballpark. None of the press should quote me on that until I can confirm it. But I actually have someone working on it right now. We'll get it to you.
Yeah, and then in addition, as I said, we're worried about, potential cuts in children's eligibility, which would then affect our poverty numbers. So anyway, we're prepared to, we've already reached out because our health services, AHS partners are also working on this issue because they also have concerns. And so I've connected with them. We're going to be, a unified front on this. And when there's an opportunity to negotiate, whether it's nutrition programs, Medicaid programs, if there's any potential cuts to child nutrition programs, in any way, all of those things, we would be working together to jointly signal to our delegation what are most important for us. If we have to negotiate, what can we give on and what can't we? The longer this goes on in some ways, the better, as far as we're concerned. They say they're gonna have something out in May. We'd be happy if they don't. Because if the new school year rolls around, a lot of these things, just, for example, if you're Medicaid eligible and therefore low income in July, which is the beginning of the new school year, as far as we're concerned, then it carries for the year. So you're enrolled for the year, you're poverty for the year, you're eligible for these programs, the program count numbers, so the longer this takes, the better. And they have ultimately until December 31st. They really have until the end of the fiscal year, which is 9/30, if they want to come in under the fiscal year. But they actually have until December 31st because that's when the tax cuts expire. That's kind of their drop dead deadline is our understanding.
So what's the May 15th deadline we keep hearing about? That's the reconciliation.
That's their own deadline that they've set.
Okay.
And,
The
you know,
administration.
the administration, and that would be to announce their plan. And if they have 100% support and can ram it through really quickly, I suspect they will not. That's just a hunch, but I mean, we're not the only state that cares about Medicaid, that is heavily invested in Medicaid, for example. So we know from our partners in other states that they are equally worried regardless of, whether they're primarily this or that party. So there probably will be some negotiation about some of this. Also, between the administration saying there will be no cuts publicly, and the fact is that there'll have to be some cuts unless they're playing games on paper. So as far as FY 26, nothing has been unveiled. The first step is for the president to unveil a budget. That would just start the conversation, and then each of the appropriations committees would get to work. And the different, like the education committee, the transportation committees and all would get to work. And there's many steps in that process. So we were sort of told by our delegation that they expect another continuing resolution for the beginning, at least the beginning of next fiscal year. They don't think anything's going to be in place for October 1.
Yeah, and so that's for federal fiscal year, which is right, October 1.
Which would be in this case for education funding the following school year, not next school year. So a lot is in play, lots on hold. A couple of things we also heard that are more positive. One of them is that we were encouraged to think about flexibilities. That, in this sort of mantra of returning education to the states and control of education to the states, Ed does have some authority within, for example, ESEA to grant waivers of certain requirements. Many of them cannot be waived. Most of them can't be waived, but there are some that can, and particularly in the area, for example, of assessment and accountability programs. So we're looking already at, what we might want to consider. For example, in assessment, if we find that the current restrictions or the current language is too constricting and we might want to, do something slightly different, what would that look like? We were actually explicitly told that if you've applied in the past and you've been denied, apply again. We have a different tone in this administration. We're open, we're less risk averse, we're open to flexibility. We also, it's not such a big deal for Vermont because we actually have applied for a number of years now for what's called EdFlex authority, and we have it. So we're actually delegated to give some of the waivers that otherwise districts would have to apply directly to Ed to get. We do that directly at the state agency. So for example, Title IV has these very rigid spending buckets that we get numerous requests every year to waive, and we can because we have EdFlex authority. Other states would have to individually have their LEAs apply to Ed for that. So there's not a lot of areas where we feel constrained right now, but we're going to look into all of them since they've offered. The other thing is, in terms of data burden, except for
annual performance.
Except for the worst data burden
This
of all.
was my face when I was.
Yeah. They did talk about how, they're very much wanting to reduce the data burden on states, and they know that that's a problem. And they actually, in terms of Title II and IV reporting, did convene groups of states to review those reports and give feedback. And they've offered everyone an opportunity this week to give feedback before they release those. They've held them up, they're delayed. And we'll see if they modify those based on, our input. The previous administration gave opportunities for input and then didn't particularly follow them, like with Stronger Connections grant. So it'll be interesting to see if they do take up, some state input as far as what's actually useful and what would be more useful. We
And
hope.
can I note something? There was also, in the sort of meeting with Secretary McMahon, there were, other state chiefs who were sort of signaling, to her, that some of the very early decisions before she was confirmed, to end contracts have a real impact on federal data quality. So, there are folks contacted by the federal government that provide technical support and resources to the states to really help them not only ensure that their, federally required data is of high quality and that they can actually complete those submissions. So for example, EdFacts is live right now. And it's not clear entirely how states are going to be able to accomplish all of that. There isn't sort of the back end support that's usually there, but then also the use of data, right? And the use of things like the What Works Clearinghouse is now, that website is shut down, which is used as evidence-based practices that districts use in their grant applications to demonstrate that the strategy that they're going to use has a base in research, right? So that was signaled to her, and I would say that she was at least receptive to a review because those decisions were made by Doge, and she was receptive to her staff reviewing some of those decisions and understanding the implications of them. So there was not any statement of like, we're no longer collecting federal data. And they're doing that from the perspective of parents need to understand, right? So what do parents need to know? It might not be the strategy, but if it's an entry point for getting what we need in terms of high quality federal data, then, let's find areas of concern. But that was part of the conversation as well.
All you received from Secretary McMahon was I'll look into it and I'll consider it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, that data website that was so crucial is shut down.
Yes, and a lot of states actually downloaded materials ahead of time so that they would still, and districts did as well, so that they still had access to those resources.
So that's where we are.
That's where we are.
So just as somebody who, listens to the news, I just didn't know what was meant when they talked about increased flexibility. To me, it almost sounded like they were just gonna block grant IDEA dollars to the states. But your take on things is, no, it's not gonna be that unrestricted, or could it be? And what would
It
something
takes
like,
Congress to do that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't speculate on what it would look like. That was sort of our reading between the lines of it as well. As of Friday, I am loath to speculate based on what I've heard locally said.
if they were to take off all of these, and just block grant the money to the states, and this idea of turning education back to the states, a fair bit of the people who work at the AOE are in the federal compliance business. What would again, I'm asking you to speculate, I apologize, but what would the impact be on how the AOE operates and the staffing?
I was just gonna say, before we move on to that question in relation to this, one thing that we were told in terms of the reconciliation that was actually kind of disturbing to me, was our understanding has always been that anything like what you're talking about, which is a programmatic change, that's something that's specified. The formulas and all the rest are in ESEA. They're specified. We're always told those things have to go through Congress, through the normal process to be changed. Within reconciliation, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility. And we were told that it is possible that programmatic changes can be put into a reconciliation bill so long as they can argue that the primary impact is fiscal in the numbers going up and the numbers going down. So that's why we don't want to speculate. We don't know. And we did talk extensively to our delegation about and to the folks at Department of Ed about things like maintaining the administrative reservations, that there has to be an administration of
For the
these.
states.
For the states, yes, there has to be an administration of these programs, even if they take a different form. Maintaining things like supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of equity and some of the, or effort, some of the fiscal tests, so that states couldn't just decrease LEA spending, and defy the intent of the law. But unfortunately, until there's actually language, we're not in a position with our delegation to negotiate that language, because right now there's no language. So there might be nothing that comes up in reconciliation about this, or there might be some information that we then have to, weigh in on. So,
Yeah, I would also add the rhetoric is one of reducing burdensome processes, and allowing states, and it's never clear what's meant by states. Is that meant the governor?
Which
Does it mean
states?
the state education agency? What does state control mean? Is unclear. Allowing states to be leaders in instruction and educational leadership, right? So as we sort of think our way through this, I don't think that we actually disagree that some of these federal data reporting requirements are burdensome, not only for the agency, but for districts, for classroom teachers, right? I mean, this is actually one of the sort of trends in education is over the past 20 years, the sort of administrative burden of data reporting and template after template and form after form has really increased exponentially, and that has taken away the ability of principals and superintendents and special educators to do that thing that they want. So is there potential there that a reduction in some of those more burdensome requirements may actually have the benefit of allowing folks to be able to do more learning and teaching, right? Which is sort of what we want to happen. At the agency level, depending on so for all of these formula grants, it's called the administrative set aside. It's what we pay agency staff to be able both to do the compliance functions, the financial functions, and programmatic support. If we had less of the reporting and compliance, but the same amount of money, what would we do? I mean, I think we would very clearly invest in the kind of support and leadership and on the ground field work that we would all like to be doing. So that we would use that money to sort of drive those strategic priorities and movements in the field. So we're going to have to kind of navigate our way through really uncertain territory. If we take them at their word, there may be opportunity there. ...
I don't mean to dominate the questions committee. Anything? Representative Brady?
Thank you for going, for asking the questions, for advocating, for trying to stand up for Vermont in this really unprecedented moment. I appreciate the
It's an otherwise lovely conference.
the effort to sort of see positives and potential. I feel no need to sugarcoat it as such. And I think we're just living in a terrifyingly dangerous time and moment. And I think we, as a state and as an education committee and legislature, have to keep in mind all of the things at play. And while we may disagree between parts of the legislature and the governor's office, the administration, about transformation timeline and work that we want to do in the state to increase equity of opportunity for all students and to bend the cost curve in our education spending. And the House obviously passed out our plan last week. There's a broad level agreement, disagreement perhaps on some of the details and timelines, but broad level agreement on kind of the direction we're going. However, there's like a giant asterisk in my mind next to all of it, which is that if the agency has to spend all of their time deciphering, quite frankly, disgusting, disrespectful letters from our federal agency of education and, you know, getting that out to LEAs at 5 o'clock on Friday to quickly move around paper, that is the moment we are in that none of us at this moment can control. And so our hopes about developing a statewide calendar, developing a statewide student information system, or developing guidance to help districts with business processes towards consolidation, will take a back seat to the hottest fire burning at the moment. And so I guess I'm not sure it's a question so much as it just feels to me like this enormous asterisk that I hope we are all, you know, cognizant of in this, again, just absurd moment that we are in. And I appreciate the balancing you're doing in sort of surviving day to day in the world that we're in and thinking towards the future. We all want to be thinking towards the future. And the barriers being put up in the moment are just.
Can I respond? I know there was a question, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's certainly not helping, you know. I would say, you know, way back in January, when we sort of came in with all the data, one thing that we had signaled is, you know, the federal funding in Vermont is not as high of a percentage as it is in many other states. So for most districts, it's 5 to 10%, right? And so that helps us a little bit, like it's a lot, right? It's a lot of noise and a lot of impact. And also there's the executive orders and all of that. But in terms of sort of the larger scope of education funding, it's not a huge amount of money. But what is my biggest cause for concern is that what we were able to show is that under our current funding system, the way that it's playing out in the real world is that our higher needs communities are spending in the state funding less per pupil than our better resourced communities. And where we are making up that difference is those federal dollars. So that to me is like that vulnerability. And so I don't disagree with you at all that it's distracting. It's certainly taking my time in ways that I don't love. But it also, for me, also really highlights the urgency in some ways. And so I fully note and appreciate that this is distracting and we're trying to do really big, complicated work that needs our attention. And at the same time, for me, it is driving that sense of urgency because where the impacts are felt are disproportionate. So that is part of my thinking as well. And, you know, I promise I was not trying to put a rosy glow on this, but there really is some strategic thinking that we could do. If the administration genuinely does this thing that they're talking about, and if we were in a different state, I would have a different answer. But I live in Vermont, where we have an incredible commitment and support to public education. It's something I value as a Vermonter and as a parent and as an educator. So what would we do with more state flexibility? I think we would actually use that state flexibility to drive towards some of these strategic priorities. We are disadvantaged at the state level and the district level by our little scale when it comes to federal reporting requirements. It's a thing, right? And so we, you know, those administrative minimums, we always get the minimum. It's never enough. It's the same since the early 90s. 94. That admin minimum has not increased since 1994. We have been advocating for this. Anne has been amazing in this space nationally for several years now. So we do suffer from that scale. Those requirements are disproportionately burdensome on very small states with small agencies of education. So not in any way discounting the disruption, the anxiety, the direct impacts this has on students and teachers and leaders, not just the financial, but obviously the executive orders. But we actually could see some ways to leverage these changes. So we're trying to think that way as well. How could we actually do some things that we want to? But I do, I know it's no fun to like come back around to the ed transformation, but there is this urgency because we do know how the funds support students, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds in the state. And so how do we think about unhooking ourselves from that? And that's kind of that work again.
I can say, in terms of colleagues at the agency, that as stressful as all of this is, we're kind of bifurcating our attention. People are doing their work.
Yeah.
Things are still happening, like everybody's dealing with being a citizen in this moment and being a parent in this moment and being an agency of education employee in this moment and an educator. But they're also kind of putting that over here, we all do, and then, you know.
Yeah, you still have grant applications to.
Amendments are
You
due
still
April
have
15th,
technical
you know,
assistance.
final
All of that's
amendments,
happening.
technical assistance, you know, we're opening the new app, we're doing training, you know, people are, I'm really proud of our agency actually, you know, and staff for doing that.
I gotta say, you know, you still are going through all of that. And I just have this picture of all of these emails going to an empty office because the Department of Education has been hollowed out. And that, you know, it's
Well,
kind of a scary image.
our colleagues there are under even more pressure than we are.
The
And
few that are left.
And the ones that are left are still responding extremely professionally to us. I mean, I give them all the credit. You know, we have an open amendment for ESSA that we're communicating with them regularly on a weekly basis and, you know, so.
And I mean, I think it's also important to note, like on the day-to-day, we don't interact with them.
Yeah.
But we're not reliant on them for our day-to-day work. We have our work, we do our work. So I agree. I think folks are forging ahead.
Representative Brown?
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just gonna say, to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, I think a lot of us are experiencing the urgency of this moment in different ways. And I think for me, the urgency that I feel is to be really careful and thoughtful and deliberate in how we approach education transformation in a moment that feels frankly really perilous. And I think we've heard that from our partners in the field. So really want to sort of highlight that perspective in all of this mix of difficult and challenging things that we're talking about.
Yeah. I think all of us have a commitment that we don't want to do harm to an already fragile system. And I think that is a shared commitment. There's different ways to get there, right? And that's the work that we're all trying to do collectively. There's not one path. So I think as long as we sort of give each other the grace of knowing that we are actually all trying to achieve those same goals and that there are different approaches to achieve those goals. I think that's really important.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that. And I totally agree. If we're gonna be in any state right now and we're gonna have more flexibility, I have a lot of faith in Vermont and in our
We're
education
lucky.
landscape, and we're lucky, and you know, that as a parent, first and foremost, I don't have grave concerns that flexibility would be used in ways that are bad for kids and for public education. I think to the other things you've said, my bigger concern is like 5 to 10% reduction in federal funding. I certainly don't disagree that there are inequities in our system, and we're all interested in righting those and ensuring that resources are going to our highest need students. And they are likely, those places will be hit hardest by much of the, you know, federal shenanigans that are happening right now. But regardless, if we take all of the situation we're dealing with, policy-wise, fiscally, and ways and means right now, and reduce it by 5 to 10% at the same time that we've been facing these property tax increases and are trying to be more appropriate. There's no good news there. And there are no easy decisions or way out of that isn't going to be painful and hard in all places.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, we should, as we're doing this work together, we should be, you know, as I just said, there isn't just one way to get there, and we should be responsive to the moment, right? So, you know, the proposal that was put out in January was in one context, we're in a different context.
Yeah.
How could we flex that? How might we adjust, right? How might we think about our current moment? And when we have a lot of other uncertainties as well. But I would caution against, I think it's very easy and understandable to feel like, whoa, there's too much. We should actually pull back. I think it's more, how do we lean in together collaboratively to figure it out? And again, in that way that, like, first and foremost, let's not do harm. Let's collaboratively navigate our way through this. I do think that there's some good ideas floating around. But I just caution against feeling like we can't do anything because we don't have an answer for how we move forward in this context as we currently are. And that, I think we do know we will continue it if nothing else changed, right? If there was no federal difference happening here, we still need to address this because we do know that our current path forward is one of cut, right? That is our current path. So how can we move forward and do this thoughtfully, collaboratively, and in light of changing circumstances? I actually do have faith. I know it's a tough moment right now in the session. I actually have faith that we can do this work. We just need to sort of, and maybe I'm going to be optimistic here because I've had coffee. Maybe this is a catalyst for us and maybe having a moment to come back together and how can we actually help to navigate this so that we are really supporting our schools and our system, which I think we all have a commitment to do.
Unless there's another question, I'd like to end
Should we
on
end
that
on that
note.
note? Fantastic.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of you coming in, frankly, in a short notice with everything else going on. So it's really illuminating to us.
Yeah. We're committed to continuing to provide those updates.
Yeah.
We have the link on our website as things get posted. I have a to-do that's already underway for a different committee, so I'll just share with you the breakdown of the school-based Medicaid and like how it financially supports the system. I think we've got that. We're also working with our partners in AHS to understand the implications of that. They have sort of the big Medicaid piece and the slice of it. So, and as we finalize the STA kind of information, happy to share, and we'll always happy to come in and provide updates.
And we'll definitely let you know when, I don't want to say if, I want to say when we get the allocations and whether they correspond to what we expected. So.
Optimism, purpose, and calm.
Thank you
All right,
both.
thank you all.
Thank
Maybe just
you.
a couple of things. Because this was so important, I did not want to put any sort of limit on our time. Our 11:30 testimony, I bumped at 11:45. We have some students who are enrolled in the early college program through CCV, essentially, I think, are going to spend some time with us before lunch. So that's that. And then just a correcting of the record when we were talking previously going about all of the things with the government ops legislative council. I said that there was nothing in the original H454 about proportional representation, and in fact, it calls for proportional representation. And so we got that long explanation of what it takes to create that. That's it.